All right. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 Interconnection Process Enhancement Scoring Criteria Working Group meeting. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. I'm also joined by Danielle Mills, Principal of Infrastructure Policy, and Bob Emmert, Senior Manager of Interconnection Resources. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting is posted to the Policy Initiative webpage. You can find that under the Stay Informed tab of the California ISO's website. Next slide, please. Before we get started, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And we really want these working groups to be collaborative and stimulate open dialogue to engage different perspectives. But we do ask that you keep your comments professional and respectful, and to try to refrain from repeating what has already been said. Next slide, please. There's a few ways to ask questions today or make comments throughout the meeting. If you are connected through audio using your computer or using the Call Me option in WebEx, you can click the raise hand icon at the bottom right toolbar in your window. If you're joining us through an audio only line, you can press #2. That'll add you to the queue. And if you prefer, you can drop your comment or question into the chat box, and I will read it aloud for you. When making your comment or question, please remember to state your name and affiliation beforehand. And if you need any technical assistance during the meeting today, please send the chat to the event producer. Next slide, please. So today, here's our agenda. Just starting with our introduction, Danielle's going to walk us through the objectives and working group expectations today. Then we'll move to the proposed scoring rubric and proposed interconnection caps with a few proposals from stakeholders. And then we'll close out the meeting with next steps and future working group topics and milestones. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, just a quick reminder, here is an overview of the California ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. So we've put out a discussion paper, we've put out a straw proposal, and we're still kind of in the working group process for preparing for the draft final proposal. Next slide, please. So with that, I will hand it over to Danielle to walk us through the working group objectives for today.
Thanks, Caitlin. Just want to check to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you. A little choppy, but let's see how it goes.
Okay. Well, I'll be able to listen more and talk today. We just wanted to go over our objectives for the working group today. I think if you commented on this element of the STAR proposal, and I think the balance that we're trying to strike when we refine the scoring criteria, we're really looking for objective indicators of project readiness and indicators of project readiness that are accurate and accurately reflect a project's stage in the development process. So really clear metrics that we can use to evaluate how far along or the likelihood of success for a project. With that said, we are also trying to balance that with indicators and criteria that are very easy to validate, almost binary, things that we can go through in the validation process and see a document or have some proof or assurance that that the interconnection customer does meet that criteria, and then move on quickly to the next phase of the process. So we really appreciate all the feedback that we've received from you. I know that this is a difficult, it's a difficult process and really difficult to refine, but we hope that through a couple of working group conversations with all of you, we can get there. We also, and so to that end, we have heard of at least one entity that wanted to share a proposal around scoring criteria. So we have Edison on the line and prepared to do that this morning as well, but we're open to other proposals too if you want to just bring them up through the course of the discussion around scoring criteria this morning. And then later in the morning, we did have some feedback from a number of developers that wanted to provide positions on the proposed interconnection caps. I think specifically the 25% per developer interconnection cap. So we'll do that and have a discussion of that toward the end of the morning as well. And then want to leave some time at the very end of the working group process to determine the next steps and the topics for future working group meetings with consideration of the amount of time that we have in the next really few weeks to work toward a draft final proposal and wanting to make sure that we're focusing on the right areas. Next slide, please. All right, so with that, unless anyone else wanted to chime in and say anything, I think what we wanted to do on the agenda right now is to really take some high-level feedback on the scoring criteria and as a whole, as an element, rather than getting into specific sections of the rubric. I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions about how it would be applied or make suggestions about how it would be applied. And then from there, we'll go into more of the specific criteria. So if there are suggestions on kind of how and when this element fits into the rest of the interconnection process, now is the time to bring those thoughts forward or ask questions.
All right, looks like we have a few hands raised. So let's move to Sushant Barav with Clearway Energy Group.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks. Appreciate adjusting the timing on the workshop as well as all the effort ISO has put in. Before getting into the specifics of scoring, I had a more foundational question around where the element fits. Daniel, the question you asked, we do believe that in the spirit of first ready, first serve, the scoring should be staged in some way, and more weight should be put on the actual, some sort of an interconnection study. I know Kaiso has committed to publishing a lot of information upfront before projects come into this scoring phase. We would recommend strengthening that initial phase before we talk about any scoring criteria. And ideally, we would like to see something that arrives at a dollar per megawatt cost or some pointer towards interconnection costs, not just the capacity. I know some of these elements exist in ISO's transmission capacity database, but formalizing that before getting into scoring, we think is critical. Some of the pieces of scoring that would be required at this stage, we think are going to create bottlenecks on permit applications with counties, and a very early stage community engagement could have some adverse impact. So I do really have a question around whether this entire scoring block should be implemented at one instance in the process, or should it be staged across different stages as projects move forward. And one of our recommendation was that maybe awarding interconnection capacity could be done on a rolling basis over a 1 or 2 year period, using a similar scoring criteria that we would arrive at. So would like to hear Kaiso's thoughts and anyone else's thoughts around moving the pieces from this proposal at different times in the interconnection process.
Yeah, thanks, Sushant. I'm going to see if Bob wants to say anything too, but I think my initial, I guess, clarification of how we were thinking of applying this is that I think there is some openness to consideration of, different types of kind of stages in the development process, and recognition that particularly on the commercial side, a lot of the commercial developments or milestones aren't hit until later in the process after the study is complete. So I think that's why we were thinking about this element and the TPD allocation element as being sort of two allocation criteria based on how we refine the scoring criteria, because we recognize there are certain expectations that are reasonable to have earlier in the development process that might be ripe for this type of scoring criteria early in the process, and other types of milestones that are more reasonable to expect after the study, and that those could be considered in the TPD allocation process. So I think if you want to try to, if all stakeholders want to try to sort of sift or sort the different criteria between what's early stage and a reasonable expectation early in the interconnection process versus later stage and maybe better considered in the TPD allocation process, that might be worthwhile. I'd be curious to hear more discussion and thought about how we could implement a more rolling evaluation process than that without making it a pretty confusing process for everyone.
Danielle, you were breaking up a little bit towards the end. I think I got where you were saying that trying to think about making it a rolling window without making it confusing. Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and to that effect, I think the TPD allocation itself, yes, doing that later in the process totally makes sense. We were pointing more towards the gating item itself, where just being being selected for a study and requiring offtakes or some elements of scoring criteria, which we believe at that early of a stage could result in a lot of unintended consequences, irrational outcomes as well, which eventually off-takers may suffer because of that. So those are some of the thoughts where can we think about picking some of these as early stage gating items and some of these are later stage, and how do we incorporate that in a rolling assignment? And for all of that, I think the prerequisite is a much more detailed interconnection study, which again, I think it will have to be done on a portfolio basis, which has infinite combinations. But if we are to solve that problem, I think we would have to have a much higher level of confidence in interconnection outcomes upfront without performing a Q analysis. And that's was one of our comments, and would like to hear from any other developers if they have any thoughts as well.
Shashank, this is Bob Emmerich. I'd like to just kind of probe a little bit into your thinking. Our thoughts were that we need to get the number of interconnection requests that we actually get to the stage of validation and study to a level to achieve, the principal goals of the IEP. One of them is, one of the major ones is to study the appropriate amount to where the study results are accurate and actionable. And so we're, the biggest thing that we're struggling with is how do we accomplish that? Can we develop scoring criteria that is robust enough, is well defined to produce appropriate results so that we can determine the projects that we actually score? And we're concerned that the scoring process in and of itself may not be able to do that. So we've proposed an auction process as a second step. And just thinking about that proposal, it demonstrates our concern that it's not going to be an easy process, and scoring by itself may not be able to produce the final results that we need. So I'm struggling with some sort of a rolling process that would be able to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, our thought behind rolling process was that there will be an interconnection study at scenario level. So similar to how the portfolios are studied today, but maybe with a few more combinations. And this would be in lieu of this high level of interconnection requests. And that points people to specific locations, specific interconnection outcomes and costs. And the thinking is that that narrows down the playing field or locations at least. And then we are supportive of a scoring criteria, but it's at that later stage where a very robust interconnection study has been performed upfront. That when I acknowledge that there is a lot of uncertainty in scenarios that Kaiso would have to look at, uh, but something that would look largely like a portfolio level study uh, that provides much more details than what we have been hearing so far about the information being put out up front. And I'm raising this because I think this is an important piece before we get into the actual scoring and how we should do the points assignment.
Actually, Sean, I will just raise a bit of a concern is that we are in the process of working through how we're going to comply with the FERC order 2023 and within the timeline that FERC has prescribed with it for the study process. And adding additional components to that study timeline would make it to where we wouldn't be able to comply with their basic order. And so that's been our goal, at least, to do our best to comply to the greatest extent possible without doing some independent variables or variation to their order.
Yeah. Understood. And I mean, this may mean that the request window itself, you may have to think about a different timing and cadence for that. But yeah, I wanted to insert that thought up front. So thanks.
Right. So we do have a few. We have 6 or 7 hands raised. So let's move to Renee Steichen with Rev Renewables. Renee, I saw your hand go down. So if you still want to, there you are.
There I am. Yeah, I was muted. Sorry. Hi, Renee Steichen with Rev Renewables, and you know, I'll try not to repeat stuff that Sushant said. I think we largely agree with that. You know, we're just concerned overall with some of the scoring elements. You know, trying not to get into that now, but really want to think hard about whether there's, you know, whether we can raise the baseline requirements instead of having the scoring rubric. You know, we think it's important for projects, especially if there's certain requirements in there that are going to take a significant amount of investment, that you know you have some level of certainty going into the process that you're actually going to get studied. You know, you don't want to spend thousands or millions of dollars on a project and then just because some other projects were, you know, a couple points higher, you're not going to get studied that year, and you might have to wait another year and a half to enter the next queue. So, you know, I think if we can do something to increase the requirements, you know, and I think even the FERC order 2023 site control requirements, you know, I'd be interested in seeing information on that. I saw in some of the other comments as well of like how many cluster 15 projects, for example, have site control versus use the deposit in lieu. You know, will that actually, will that requirement clear out a significant portion of the queue, or will that still lead to the level of volume that is still going to be a difficult volume to manage? So, you know, if we can pick a couple things to increase the baseline requirements and then set more increasing requirements along the way in the different phases of the study process, then that will provide more certainty to the developers as well on what they need to do and then also not place unnecessary burden on, I guess, on the whole community, I think, CAISO included, and also even like the local level and the off-takers, you know, on doing any sort of commercial offtake agreements or permitting requirements that aren't actually going to be used, those types of things. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. That's interesting and helpful.
Let's move to Tony Zimmer with MCPA.
Thank you very much. And not sure where this fits in the structure of the discussion today, because we're just making general comments in the context of the scoring rubric. But just as a load serving entity, our perspective is that much of the investment that will be made going forward is really focused on developing projects that will ultimately be used to serve load, and that will meet the various either commercial or regulatory obligations of load serving entities. So as we've stated in our comments submitted in response to the straw proposal, we believe that some connection or relationship with a load serving entity, be it some form of letter of intent, shortlisting in a competitive RFP or something to that nature. I know there's been concerns stated over the reference to a formal PPA in light of the timing of some of the availability of study information, but we still feel that it would be appropriate to put a heavy weighting on establishing relationships between projects that are being proposed to be developed in load serving entity offtakes with rate base, since ultimately we feel like those projects that have direct relationships and a stronger linkage to an off-taker with rate-based capability and rates probably are the most viable. And then also kind of as a sub-component of that, ensuring that projects that are being developed by a utility or load serving entity also carry a fairly heavy weighting, because in that instance, utilities that have rate-based capability and that have the ability to raise financing and that may ultimately have site control and such also would be a demonstration of a very viable project. So just wanted to kind of emphasize that general comment as part of the scoring concept, but we'll pause and provide more insight as we get deeper into the discussion. But thanks for the opportunity just to put those comments out there.
Thanks.
Let's move to Aisha Berry with Recurrent Energy. Aisha, go ahead. You're unmuted. So it looks like, Aisha, you might not be connected to audio. All right, I see you've connected and now you're unmuted.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Yeah, hi. I just wanted to share support for what Sushant and Renee had just said. They've pretty much put the reasons why we first need an indication of the capacities available in the zones where the projects are, or some sort of indication of potential upgrade costs that the projects would become responsible for. I think that will in turn lead to a natural attrition in the number of projects. Nobody wants to put resources and money on projects that have no potential to move forward. And that might help address at least the concerns around getting a more reasonable number of queues. I completely understand Bob's point, But I feel like scoring criteria, yes, is that like Sushant said and Renee said, they are like the second, part of the process. The very first one is to get an indication of like how much capacity is there so that developers can redirect the resources and money and all this effort needed to come get those scores in the scoring criteria to the projects that will, like survive or that have the potential to move forward. Yeah.
Thanks. If I can follow up on that question, I think we hear and understand that and the need for some information. Is there, do you all feel like you understand the way that information will be presented in terms of where there's available capacity to do what you just mentioned, Aisha, to help you kind of prioritize where to invest or where to put your funding? And does anyone want to just sort of speak to that interaction? I know we already have a queue, so I guess if your hand is in the queue, or if you have a thought on that, maybe raise your hand, and I'd like to hear a little bit of thought on that too, just to understand if what we proposed provides that information to you, or if there's more clarity that you need.
I think there is more clarity, Daniel, that is needed at this time. I tried to read the information you shared in the proposal a bunch of times. I even asked a few friends that are on this call, like if they understand better than I do how to connect the dots and like how to make a more kind of like, because everybody, all development shops, all the investors are like, this is the most important thing for them to know whether the project, like will it comes in a zone, it has capacity, this is such a big unknown. So we're all trying very hard to figure that out. It's just I haven't been able to hit that. It's still not clear to me. I've asked a few experts, like what do they think will be right there? Everybody is making a guess, but nobody is very sure. I mean, what you provided was good information, but like some of that information probably is not the latest one. That is another issue. Like there'll be another IRP plan that will be published. I'm not sure which one we were supposed to use. It's just like knowing the exact things we need to do, having a very clear line of sight on step A, step B, step C to come up with those numbers is will be very helpful. And I feel like instead of putting it on a proposal, if we have a workshop of some sorts where we discuss this and just exactly what kinds of things are the right, versions and right files might be helpful, but I'm more than happy to hear everybody else's thought. I'm sure there'll be some more additional good suggestions on this front. But yeah, this was just what I have been experiencing so far.
And I see we have a couple hands raised, but I know a few folks want to speak on this. So maybe we'll skip around a little bit so we can stay on this topic. If you are able to, through the WebEx platform, maybe just send a chat to all panelists and say you plan to speak on this point, and we can try to jump around as much as possible. So let's jump over to Kathleen Colbert with Vistra Corp. I know you want to make some follow-up comments on this. So event producer, if you can open up Kathleen's line.
No, thank you so much. Can you hear me? It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I appreciate the discussion. This is whether or not we would have sufficient transparency into viable locations was something that we spent a decent amount of time thinking about and talking about as we work towards like providing feedback on your straw. So to kind of elevate it for the group, we asked the CAISO, Vistra asked the CAISO in our comments to commit to making this data available through the heat map that was ordered by FERC in FERC Order 2023. That heat map can have multiple layers. So what we have asked the CAISO to do is to make sure that that heat map is made available in time to inform the next opening of a cluster window. We've asked for it by July 1st of 2024. That would allow for this 23-24 TPP results to be finalized and confirmed by the board and then wrapped into the heat map before it is published. When it is published, we've asked for the physical interconnection service capacity available. We've also asked for full capacity deliverability status, interim deliverability status, and energy-only deliverability status. We've started with our wish list. I want to echo what Aisha said. A conversation, a workshop, or some discussions on this makes a ton of sense to me. Those are the 4 things that we would like to be able to see, if possible, at locations around the system. And we're very hopeful that we'll have an opportunity to get feedback from CAISO on that. We also, just to Danielle's specific question of do we feel clear, the answer, at least from my entity, is no, which is why we also provided 4 questions that we had on this data transparency. I'm not going to go through them. They are in our comments. They should be posted and online. But I think answering those questions is going to be critical. And so I'll just do the age-old request. It would be a huge help if the CAISO would do a stakeholder comment matrix and answer the questions that were submitted by stakeholders directly in response to the straw proposal so that we can see what those answers are and it can help drive us towards clarity. Happy to take any questions or pass it along to the next person.
All right, doesn't sound like any. Just for folks, I know there's a few folks who want to make comments on this, so we're going to move to Bridget, then Rayanne, and then everybody else who has their hands up. Thank you for your patience. We'll get to you after we kind of wrap up this topic. So let's move to Bridget Sparks with AES Clean Energy. And then producer, could you unmute Bridget Sparks?
I'm trying to unmute Bridget's line. Maybe it's something on her end.
Can you hear me now?
Bridget, are you connected? Is that Bridget?
Sorry, it keeps going in and out. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Are you?
Okay.
Hello, Bridget, is that you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Great. So a couple points. The first one on whether or not we have sufficient information right now, the answer is clearly no. And CAISO keeps pointing to like 4 different sets of information. And in my mind, if we're going to move forward with this scoring criteria, it needs to be absolutely clear to both the CAISO and developers what locations are in and out of a zone. If you're asking developers to invest millions of dollars in land and other development activities, there shouldn't be any uncertainty on whether or not a certain point on a transmission line is in or out of the zone. Additionally, assuming CAISO also needs to know if projects are in and out of the zone, it seems like they should also need to know upfront what the zones are. And so we think, you know, for fairness sake, this should be in one place. We shouldn't necessarily have to hire a bunch of consultants to try to figure it out. Again, the CAISO is already going to have to determine this, so why not just make that information public? I think we'd be open to Kathleen's idea about using the heat map requirement from FERC as a vehicle to do this, or as in AES's original proposal, we had suggested sort of an annual report, including line diagrams that would make this absolutely clear what the zones are and how much capacity are at each zones with sufficient enough time for developers to invest in projects. Backing up a little bit, I also wanted to talk on Shusant and Rev's point around looking at ways to sort of scale or tier this or funnel this. So one idea is CAISO could keep their two-phase process, and in phase one, increase requirements. So again, you know, the 90% site control, you could increase this to 100, as most other markets have. You could do financial readiness deposits like SCP, MISO, and PJM have. MISO is increasing theirs to 8K per megawatt, which is a significant amount of money, and use that to sort of raise the bar to get into the queue, do phase one, and then score projects moving into phase two once we have some results, and can decide whether or not we want to move forward with this project. We have more information to share with off-takers to get further along in the offtake process, be further along in the permitting process. I think a lot of other criteria could open up at that phase two mark. And then from that phase two, then really look at limiting it to that like 1.5, the capacity, and then the TBD allocation, you know, requiring things like PPAs, you know, where you're, as you get further along in the process, the requirements to stay in or be prioritized gets higher. So it's something to think about, and just some ideas I had while folks were talking. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So let's move to Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell Consulting.
This is Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell Consulting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I first have a question before I go into my comment. Is there a business person from the CAISO on the call today who could give us just a magnitude estimate on how many projects in cluster 14 or cluster 15 had actual site exclusivity as compared to the deposit?
Ryan, maybe let us huddle on that and see if we can get something rather than answering it in real time, but we can come back to it. If that's
Sure.
Okay.
I think that would really help. I think, especially now that we're at the workshop framework for this initiative, it's time we really start getting down to brass tacks and looking back at what we know about past clusters is how we do that. So I really hope that we can have that kind of information at the next meeting. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the information needed in advance of a zone-based interconnection request window. The CAISO provided a lot of really good sources of information in the straw proposal, but what stakeholders are looking for is the CAISO's help synergizing this information and presenting it in a consistent, accessible format on a timeline that supports their interconnection requests. That clarity ensures consistency of use in terms of, everybody's access to the information, and ultimately will serve CAISO in that you will get better interconnection requests if that information is easier to understand. And the CAISO in its paragraph on what you're going to provide with the next window does say that you're committed to making sure we have information about the zonal approach and developing the heat map. And I think what we're getting down to in this conversation has a lot more to do with semantics than intent. And if the CAISO could come through, maybe along with that site exclusivity information, a succinct list of the information that they will provide in that state of the interconnection report, or even with some kind of example or draft, that would really further this conversation too. Because we do need to get to a point where interconnection customers have the information they need, also regarding costs, so that they can make these decisions. And I'm sorry I missed the first 5 minutes of this meeting, but if the CAISO is also still considering moving forward with the auction mechanism, that pricing information is extremely important because that bid submission, your proposal is to come with the interconnection request. So stakeholders will need information to develop their bids on. So I know that was a lot of words. Happy to take any questions before I put my hand down.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Danielle. Oh, hello?
Oh, Danielle, did you have a follow-up question? Nope.
I was just thinking,
Oh, okay.
sorry.
Oh yeah, I would,
Okay.
can you still hear me, Danielle?
Yes.
Can we, I think stakeholders are looking for a little bit more of a commitment from the CAISO here, in terms of, what we can expect as we move forward with this work group. I know that's uncomfortable, but what you're hearing, I think, is a lot of concern in stakeholder voices today.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a stab at. I can definitely tell you where we are internally. We hear that there's maybe a lack of understanding, and that we've provided sources, but not like a clear synthesized description of how to use the information. And I think, to be totally candid with you all, we are working through the details of this ourselves, and hoping to provide a much clearer explanation of this in the draft final proposal, which is why I asked the question. I want to make sure that we understand how you all would like to have this information communicated, because we do understand that if the zonal approach is so central to the process that we're building, we need to be really clear with ourselves and with you about how that's going to work. So we are refining that as we go, and all of these comments are helpful, and we're taking notes and incorporating them. So I know that's not specifics, but we are thinking about ways that we can really communicate that better to all of you, and certainly in advance of the next interconnection window.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that reflective summary.
All right. So we'll continue on this topic, and I know a few folks have mentioned they want to comment on this topic. So Anish Nand, I know you want to speak, but if you can raise your hand, we can open up your line. All right, there you are.
Hi, this is Anish Nand with the Northern California Power Agency. I'm sorry, I had my hand up, but then I lowered it. But I'll just go ahead and echo the comments that the developers are making. And I think Bridget from AES summarized it really well. We need to have some transparent line diagrams, and the ISO has pointed us to like 4 different sources of information, and it's very hard to determine what's in and out of a zone. And so, and I know this conversation, the ISO has just committed to providing that all of that to us. I think ahead of the draft final proposal would be great if that's possible. That's all my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Anish. We appreciate that. I don't know if we can commit to getting that information to you before the draft final proposal, but we are taking the workshop suggestion into consideration, and maybe that's something that we can provide after the draft final proposal comes out, just to be realistic about timelines.
All right, let's move to Jim Shandalov with the next era energy resources.
Thank you. So I agree with some of the earlier speakers about the scoring rubric. in particular that it seems premature to apply it just to enter the queue. A couple of reasons. Sorry, 1 sec, I was running to get back to my device. Okay, so right now, no LSEs are procuring for projects with CODs in the 2030s. And because of the way that the queue is clocked from clusters 13 and 14, it's expected that anything from cluster 15 would be well in the 2030s. It's also premature to start permitting for a project in the 2030s because permits have expiration dates. So we already have a rubric for allocating deliverability, and that seems to us the more appropriate timing to apply the scoring criteria. FERC has already given good direction in Order 2023 regarding site control, and we think that's an excellent component to require to enter the queue. And then, for that matter, even applying the site control requirement to cluster 14 and earlier projects that are trying to advance the LGIAs, that would also be a good thinning mechanism for how to remove speculation out of the queue. And just something else to think about is other instruments that some other IOUs and publicly owned utilities are doing is such as Arizona Public Service and Salt River Project, is that they're implementing, if you can't meet the commercial readiness requirement, then it's an extra $7.5 million to enter the queue. And I'm not suggesting that that's our proposal here to require a $7.5 million deposit, but it's another way to call the queue and remove speculation out of the process. So just want that taken under consideration, please.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Let's move to Doug Karpa with Peninsula Clean Energy.
Morning. I had a couple of comments. Actually, I was from the LSE side of things, and I think there's still some lingering concerns about whether the mix of projects that come out of this process is going to be really appropriate for meeting all the portfolio needs. And sort of apropos of that, two somewhat unrelated comments. One, I think, was a bit of a head scratcher as to why non-CPUC jurisdictional projects would get kind of automatic priority, because that seems pretty discriminatory in terms of basically developers are going to all want to go do deals with those guys, right? If they automatically jump the queue. So that kind of curious as to what the rationale there is. But the more substantive point, I know there's a consideration of CPUC procurement orders mentioned, but one thing to flag on that is we may have already seen our last procurement order because the IRP process is potentially being revised. And so I think if this is going to be a long-lasting process, then we don't want to bake in a reference to a mechanism at the CPUC that may be going away. And so if that's the case, then the next best thing to look at to make sure that what's coming out of the queue and getting interconnected roughly matches what LSEs are going to need is probably looking at the IRP like preferred system portfolio, which is much longer, looks further off into the future than any procurement orders do. And I know that was dismissed as being duplicative, but I actually don't think it is, because yes, the TPP does define the zones, but maybe a zone's developed, in the plan because we expect there to be a bunch of solar there, but there's no guarantee that what gets developed in any zone actually matches the theoretical need that drove the zone to be created in the first place. Like maybe there's a zone that's there because we think that's a lot of people are going to build wind there, and then it turns out a bunch of battery storage people rush into that space, and then we're going to come out the back end without having the wind that initially motivated that zone for being there. So I think we do have more work to do in terms of thinking about how do we make sure that the interconnection between IRP and this interconnection process are tight enough to ensure that the mix of resources we get at the back end are solid, without, because you probably hear me talking around the notion of like expanding beyond expressions of LSE interest, because if this is looking at timeframes in the 2030s, we're not necessarily going to have clear understanding of LSE interest that far out. And so that may not be a criteria that's going to reflect what we're going to need 7 years from now. So I just wanted to put in a plug for maybe rethinking how we interact that medium, longer term planning horizon into this process. Any questions? I hope that was relatively clear.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That was clear, and I appreciate the kind of filter of looking at what we're realistically going to be needing at a given time. I think that's helpful.
I'll try to do better to come up with actual proposals going forward to be helpful. Thanks.
Go to Kathleen Colbert with Vistra Corp.
Yes, thank you. I ceded the floor back to after so that we could finish up the data transparency discussion. So I appreciate the chance to be able to follow up on kind of the higher level discussion that we're having. So from Vistra's, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. From Vistra's perspective, I would say that a lot of what the other developers have said resonates with us, and that we strongly encourage the CAISO to consider some version of this. Some version of thinking through criteria that would be required or potentially set like a minimum score that would be needed going into the studies that is reflective of what the commercial reality is that could be achieved before beginning the study. We put one thing that I was hoping that we would have a discussion on in this workshop ties into this. So one of the big discussion points I think we need to have relates to, one, these are like the CAISO, you provided a decent brainstorm of types of characteristics of projects in your table, but there is more detailed information that you need from us. So I'm hoping that we're going to step into a conversation about, for each of these elements, what is possible to achieve before beginning the studies, what is possible to achieve after completing the studies, but prior to entering into negotiating an interconnection agreement, and what is possible after an interconnection agreement. I think we need to look at the factors that you brainstormed at these different stages, and then talk about what is possible under existing commercial operations at those stages. And as we have that discussion today, I do think some of what you're hearing from the other developers about maybe how scoring isn't as appropriate or effective going into the studies will start to get clearer as we provide you the feedback on exactly what of those elements are even possible to know. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I think it will illuminate and make the point that folks are raising with you. And I think my last request is just to toss back at you and see, can we have a discussion about a principle before we go into this? So part of my comment is rooted in a principle that we have, which is that any scoring metric or rubric that we establish in this process should reflect existing commercial operations so that the interconnection process can better identify viable projects. It should not be introducing new criteria that doesn't exist in commercial operations today, such that the rule changes how commercial activities would have to occur in order to even get through these stage gates. So I wanted to start with, that is a principle, a core belief that we have, is that we're trying to work towards an approach that replicates what is existing commercial activity rather than the CAISO changing commercial activities through its scoring rubric. So with that, I'd like to toss it up get a reaction from the CAISO, and I'd also like to see if other stakeholders would like to provide some feedback to that core principle before we move into the rubric.
Hey, Kathleen, this is Danielle. I want to respond because I totally understand the challenge of this, and I do, you know, as I said in response to I think it was Sushant's and maybe Renee's comments as well. I do understand that there may be some expectations that are more reasonable later in the process after studies and things like that. So I think we can definitely go through when we get into the actual rubric. I think we can go through that and say, you know, this is reasonable to expect or not. And if it's not, then we think about pushing it until later in the process. But the challenge that we have and the reason that we're doing scoring altogether, and I think this ties back to Renee's point, is we recognize that every developer and every technology has a slightly different set of milestones that you all need to achieve, and that those milestones don't all happen in the same order for all projects, right? Like some, you know, you all have different strategies, you all have different needs depending on the project. Every project is different and unique. And so because of that, we didn't want to set these blunt requirements because there were more concerns that it's hard to establish the same requirements across the board if, you know, it might be easier for one type of project to get than another. So that's why we're doing the scoring criteria, because it allows a little bit more flexibility with development models, so that you can still get points if maybe you haven't started, and this is, I'm just being hypothetical right now, but you can get more points even if you have no need to start your permitting process now. Maybe you're farther along in ordering equipment or something like that. And so we were trying to provide you all with some flexibility and balance by even proposing the concept of scoring criteria. And I think, you know, it was a stakeholder recommendation as well. So we took it thinking that there was more support for it. It was interesting to hear that there may be more interest now in some baseline requirements rather than scoring requirements or scoring criteria. So, you know, I'm sort of trying to figure out, I think we're all trying to figure out what's going to work best and what's going to move us forward and move all of you forward in this process. But the other kind of thing that we have to remember is that from the ISO's perspective, we also really need to make sure that we're meeting that principle that we all agreed on of, I can't remember exactly the language, but the concept of, you know, prioritizing the most ready projects and right-sizing the number of studies that we're doing so that the studies are more meaningful for you. And I think that's especially important as we move toward what's likely going to be a single phase process under FERC Order 2023, that we want those studies, we need those studies to be really meaningful. So that's just a little bit of my reflection back to you of how we got here. Not to say, you know, we're like not changing
Danielle,
anything as we move forward, but I just want to share that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I feel like that was a bit more of a reflection to everything all of the stakeholders have said. But I want to make sure there's not a misunderstanding. Vistra is not saying that we have an issue with scoring rubric. What I am saying, just to make sure this is crystal clear, what I am saying is pretty much exactly what you described to me, is that what is important is that the scoring rubric be a reflection of the commercial activities that the suite of projects that are submitted into the queue could reasonably achieve based on existing commercial activities, which does allow for there to be various levels and approaches per project, but it roots it in this, what the proposal, like the principle that I want a discussion on is, but it doesn't drive changes to commercial activities. It is a rubric that's set up to reflect commercial activities as they exist today.
Yep, I understand that. And I think, you know, personally, as I think through this, when I look at something like the site control requirement, that seems like something that is going to change the sequencing of typical project development because it is this kind of across the board baseline requirement.
I agree.
Whereas
but
the
that is
scoring
one.
criteria is we're trying to create it, and maybe we need to move on into the specific criteria, but we're trying to create it in a way that enables everyone to move forward with their own development process without necessarily changing the structure.
No, and I appreciate hearing that from you. I'm not sure that all stakeholders are aligned. So the reason I'm bringing this up as a discussion point during this workshop is I think we do need to discuss this. Because some of, like, for instance, for the LSE interest, if that were to be included, it changes commercial activities, and then we will need to have a discussion about where we will have some, maybe there's a joint workshop that we need between the CPUC and the CAISO to talk about what the new commercial activity is going to be. That is a bigger thing to chunk off. But before we go into that discussion, I think we need to have a stakeholder, we need to talk amongst this group on whether or not we are open to having a scoring rubric discussion that includes elements that will force action items afterwards to change those activities or not. And I do think it's a principle that we should talk about before we get into the rubric, and I'd like to hear stakeholder feedback on it.
Danielle, you might be on double mute.
Oh no, I wasn't talking. I was waiting for stakeholder feedback.
Okay.
That's what Kathleen was asking for.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, we'll see if anybody raises their hand or if anybody drops anything in the chat related to this topic, Kathleen, and we'll come back to it if I see any hands or comments. All right, let's move to Eddie. Thank you. Let's move to Eddie Dadasti with Pars Energy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Eddie Dadashti from Pars Energy. Listening to all the comments from the stakeholder, I think at this stage, what we need is specificity. So we just don't have specific definitions of success for the scoring method. So if we could develop something like that, I think that will really create focus on the discussions. And as far as scoring is concerned, you know, everything falls under two categories: price and non-price. So we could use this to further develop the different, you know, matrix that we will use for scoring. So bottom line, you know, we need some flowcharts, some specific definitions of success and so on to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to Nancy Rader.
Hi there, good morning. So Nancy Rader with the California Wind Energy Association. We strongly agree with the many concerns that have been expressed today, specifically that we need information to see if the new site control requirement could help address the problem. And second, we need better information, as many people have said, about interconnection cost information before scoring is done. CalWIA made a reform proposal that would provide reasonable interconnection cost and timing information upfront at a nodal level, derived from phase 1 studies that could be conducted similarly to how CAISO does TPP studies for policy upgrades. And we could apply these as proxy costs for all interconnection customers. I think other folks have made similar proposals, but I haven't seen that CAISO has responded to these proposals or has seriously discussed them in stakeholder meetings. So I'm wondering if we can spend some time vetting these proposals to see if there are better ways of addressing the issue. Thank you.
Sure, Nancy, I can just quickly respond to that. So I think what's the best use of our time right now is to move from the point of the straw proposal and the purpose of today's workshop is to specifically focus on the scoring criteria and how it fits into the bigger process. And I think we're about to jump into the more specific refinements. I'm sorry that you feel that we didn't sufficiently address your proposal after the first round of working group meetings. I think one big thing that changed, in addition to us just sort of hearing feedback and thinking through the process, is the FERC order, which sort of, you know, is first priority for us to be able to make sure that we're compliant with those new requirements, and then we have to kind of build the interconnection process enhancements around that. And I know that you know, you all are kind of digesting the FERC order as well. We're in the process of looking through red lines to the tariff. But I think that did make some of the individual proposals that came forward in the first round of working group less feasible for us to consider or implement. So that's a big part of the reason that a lot of those didn't move forward. We did take what we think we can work with, and that got into the straw proposal, and are hoping to kind of refine those elements and, you know, if necessary, move them around a little bit as we develop the draft final proposal.
Well, just to respond briefly, I think the risk in that approach is that we could end up in a place that doesn't work, and then we're out of time. And it would be better to consider up, you know, sooner whether there are better approaches to take. And you know, this, as someone indicated, you know, the site control requirement itself may get us a long way to the goal, and maybe will buy us time to develop a more workable proposal. But okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right, well, that's all I see for hands raised and comments in the chat. So Danielle, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, and I think actually, per the request that we've heard now a few times, I think Bob is able to share some data that we have on clusters 14 and 15, and we can go ahead, Bob.
Okay, for cluster 14, this data, I believe, was at the time we received the interconnection request. I'm not quite so sure about this one, but for cluster 14, basically 35% had site exclusivity documents and 65% provided a deposit, which is very similar to what we had for cluster 15, where 36% instead of 35 provided documents and 64% provided a deposit. That has shifted a bit between when we originally accepted cluster 15 interconnection request to where now it's gone from 195 provided documentation to now it's up to 223. So, so people are actually working on getting site exclusivity now. Now these numbers are site exclusivity, which are based on the ISO definition of site exclusivity of 50%. And what FERC is requiring in their order is site control at the interconnection request stage of 90%. So there is a difference between what FERC is requiring and what these numbers represent.
Thanks. And just to clarify too, when Bob mentioned the 223 projects, I think that was for cluster 15, not cluster 14, just to be clear.
We do have a hand raised from Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting. Let's go ahead and open up Susan's line.
Hear me okay? Oops.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I just was trying to write that down really fast here, what you just said. The numbers that you're giving, those are the numbers of applications, right? Not necessarily the capacity.
That's correct. It's by interconnection request.
Okay, it would be helpful in some ways because you've got two things in play here in trying to cull down the number of applications. One of them is sort of the processing, the administrative processing, where you can't do 550 applications necessarily, in any reasonable time, just to process them and do scoping meetings and all that, and then do the studies. And then the other issue though is the reality or the realisticness or the accuracy or of the studies themselves, where if you've got a huge amount of capacity, you know, it's going to trigger, you know, 40 new 500 kV lines or something like that, where basically you've got the number of capacity that the amount of capacity that may distort the results. So you've got almost two things. You've got your admin thing and you've got your study realism kind of also in play here. It would be helpful to know, and if you can't do it today, that's okay, but it would be helpful to know when we talk about can you solve the problem with just site exclusivity, which could go a long way in both areas. Is it possible? I mean, you've got 65 projects at Cluster 15 that have over 1,000 megawatts each, and I'm going to take a wild guess that probably all of them don't have a lot of site exclusivity in there. And I think a lot of that was distorted by the fact that people didn't know and still don't know when Cluster 16 is coming in, so they possibly upsize their applications just in case. So it would be helpful to know, and not necessarily like right this minute, but in terms of numbers of applications with the admin part, how many of those, you know, I think you've given us at least some of those in terms of the percentage numbers, but how many of those actually have it and don't, and also the amount of capacity that has documentation for site exclusivity versus does not. Again, I think you've got both problems there, and you can't, if you solve one but not the other, it won't necessarily help you. So I think it would just be good to get a feel for both of those measures when it's possible to provide that. That's all I've got.
Thanks, Susan. We'll huddle and see what we can share.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Questions.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Well, let's move into the specifics of the scoring criteria. And Caitlin, I'm sorry, I don't have the agenda up in front of me, but are we gonna go into the actual criteria first, or are we gonna hear from Southern California Edison?
We are going to hear from Southern California Edison first.
Okay, great.
All right. So the folks from Southern California Edison presenting, you should now be on the speaker panel and have audio access. For our event producer, could we move to the next slide? All right. So the folks at SCE, go ahead and unmute your line. You should be able to take it from here. If not, just send me a chat and we can recalibrate. Virginia, I see your line's unmuted.
Okay, good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the very interesting discussion so far. I really appreciate the opportunity to get together with the stakeholders and the KSO. So let's get started. As you can see here, so my name, we're gonna have we're three the three of us from Edison. My name is Virginia Gross. I'm a senior advisor in the origination team within SCE's Energy Procurement and Management Department, responsible for negotiating PPAs to support SCE's procurement efforts. I'm also joined here today by Jean Lee, also senior advisor in EPM origination and responsible for negotiating PPAs, as well as leading SCE's midterm reliability procurement activities. Also joining us this morning is Loïc Gaillac, Principal Manager of Contract Management in EPM. So on the procurement side of the house, we put a lot of thought into how the KSO STRA proposal scoring criteria metrics could work, given how our procurement mandate works, and also how the interconnection process fits into our procurement RFO timeline. And today, that's what we will be sharing with you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Before we get into the details of SC's proposal, I just wanted to very quickly display here our understanding of the many topics covered in the straw proposal. And today, we'll be only focusing on the scoring point system of the straw proposal, which is designed to primarily assess project viability. The second box here that's highlighted in red in the flow chart. So as all of you know, and we've started discussing that this morning, the KSO has proposed a 6-category criteria point system to select projects that would be eligible to enter the queue to be studied up to the 150% of the available or planned capacity in each preferred zone. And as you may recall from the stakeholder call, it's also written in the straw proposal and reiterated this morning. The KSO emphasized that the criteria need to be reasonable for projects at the interconnection request stage and easily validated. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here, basically, what you see is a snapshot of the KSO proposal. On the left is the what was submitted in the straw proposal. And to the right is SC's proposal with our recommended changes in red. So you can see we've made some changes. But before I get into those, I do want to acknowledge that we thought that the KSO proposal goes a long way in setting up a framework for, a scoring system that will improve the likelihood of project entering the queue, making it to the finish line, which ultimately, whether you are an LSC like us or a developer as we have on the call right now, that's what we're all looking for. So we'll go into more details on the next slide to discuss each change, but at a high level, with our proposed changes, we will focus on areas where we thought we could either expand upon or supplement the KSO proposed scoring mechanism framework. Now, a big concern for SCE was how the KSO defined interest from off-takers. As you all know, letters of interest come in different flavors of commitment and are non-binding. So we don't think that it is a valid measure of off-taker interest. And the other concern we had was about the KSO still retaining the executed PPA as a measure of commercial readiness. Most stakeholders, in fact, were also very concerned about that. So our proposed category A here is an attempt to address SC's team concerns. So now let's dive into the details of SC's proposal with regards to the off-taker interest. If we could go to the next slide, please. So as you can see in red here, we propose to measure interest from off-takers by both the commercial readiness scoring criteria proposed by the KSO, with some caveat, and which we also renamed its contracting status. And two, and this is new, an LSC's interest based on a load share weighted LSC bonus point scoring system. Now that's a long description, so we've actually been calling it LSC bonus for short. And now, as far as how an LSC would choose to allocate its bonus points, we envision that it would be based on the general interest of the project, looking, for example, at project characteristics or how it meets CPUC procurement requirements. And although it would be early in the process, it could also be based on specific conversation about the projects if LSC had already entered into some of them. The other change we made, as I mentioned before, was to try to limit the unintended consequences of keeping an executed PPA as a criterion. Of course, we continue to strongly oppose keeping the executed PPA, but if the KSO insists on keeping it as a criterion, we do have an alternative, and this is what we're proposing. To mitigate the possibilities of gaming, which is our main concern, we propose that executed PPA points could only be awarded to PPAs with a provision that requires developers to post a minimum of $4 per kW. Now, specifically, this development security will need to be posted to the off-taker prior to submitting the interconnection request application and would need to remain posted for the duration of the interconnection process. A very important with that caveat is that projects that with an executive PPA who have not met this requirement would get 0 points, even though they may have a signed PPA in hand. And finally, on this slide, and I think somebody actually brought it up earlier today, we also wanted to point out that we're still unclear about CAISO's plan to automatically include in the study process certain types of projects designated by non-CPUC jurisdictional LSEs. Instead of bypassing the interconnection request intake process, we would propose that these types of projects could fall under the contract status category above. But more discussion are probably needed on this. Now, on the next slides, I'll go into why we think SC's proposal improves the interconnection request intake process, as well as what we would need to consider during subgroup discussions as we develop the LSE bonus point system. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, as far as how SC's LSE's bonus point proposal improves the IR intake process, as we were thinking through it, we found that under this approach, LSEs are given more control to identify projects that serve their mandated needs. So it would allow the IR intake and procurement processes to be better aligned, which is one of the key objectives of the IP initiative. Second, and I think Doug brought it up earlier this morning, it could ensure resource diversity. The current scoring system does not explicitly do it. So you could imagine a scenario where all studied projects would be battery storage system, for example, or all the projects are solar projects. And LSE's input could influence the ratio of projects entering the queue to align with LSE's procurement requirements to mitigate the risk of that type of situation occurring. And the last point here is that, by its nature, that LSE bonus system would increase the scrutiny of projects seeking to enter the queue, and therefore the likelihood of viable projects entering the queue, which again is what we're looking for. And now, as mentioned earlier, there is still a lot of work to be done to define, how an LSE bonus point framework would work. But here are some key factors that we thought we would need to consider when we workshop this in subgroups this morning or in a subsequent workshop. Some are listed on this slide, and I'm pretty sure that there would be others. So the first one is, how are the points allocated depending on whether an LSE needs partial offtake or full offtake of the project? There are situations where the off-taker interest may just be interested in a portion of the interconnection capacity request. The other thing we need to think about is, what kind of data LSEs would need to make an informed decision on how to best allocate their bonus points. Third, how do we make sure that the interest from the off-taker criteria result in a resource mix that mirrors the CPUC requirement? And the last one, number 4, what is the impact of the interest from off-taker criteria on any additional workload for both the ISO and the LSE to manage that type of system? So, we know everything isn't developed yet, even though as I mentioned before, we did put quite some thought into it. There's still much more to be developed, and the devil is and will be in the details. But we think that in collaboration with our stakeholders here, we can use the subgroup forum to develop this LSE bonus point system that would define how LSEs are granted the bonus points, and also how LSE would award their bonus points to projects. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry, no, the slide before, slide 6, please. Okay, great, thank you. Sorry about that. So this is actually the last slide, and it's about other proposed changes we made to the scoring system. First, as you can see here, we've added long lead items procurement as a sign of commercial readiness. By this, we mean, for example, the procurement status of major equipment and other long lead items such as transformers. This is another area where the details of what should be included in the commercial readiness criterion should be discussed in subgroups. The second change we made is under the project attribute category. We wanted to clarify that meeting the requirements of a current CPUC procurement order or non-jurisdictional LSEs RFP should also include the online dates to make sure that the project would come online when it's needed. What we wanted to avoid here is a project that fits the technical requirement of the order, for example, but comes online outside of the time frame mandated. Third, we made a minor change to the expansion of an operational facility criterion because we felt that an expansion of an existing facility where there is no existing GenTie that can accommodate the project should not have almost as many points as one with a GenTie with sufficient surplus capacity. Talking with our interconnection and engineering folks, the ratio didn't seem right. So we've adjusted the ratio to reflect their inputs. And finally, we added a new criterion to measure developer viability. Basically, a project would be awarded points if one or more members of the project development team at a project of a similar technology and capacity, either under construction or completed. So that wraps us SC's proposal. Thank you very much, and we can open it up for questions. Any questions? Next slide, please.
Thank you. We do have a handful of questions, so let's go to Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting. Producer, can we unmute Susan's line? There we go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I wonder if you could go back to the prior slide. I just had a couple of clarifying questions or just observations. I think as far as the commercial readiness goes, one of the issues that we had when we were talking about long lead time procurement is that procurement is somewhat fungible. I mean, if you're buying equipment for one site, you could use it for another site. So it almost seems like you'd have to have something that a little more tied to the project in some way or the site or something. You already got site exclusivity, so I'm not sure, you know. So anyway, I think if commercial readiness is going to be applied, it needs to be applied in a way that actually is project specific and not something that could easily be just sort of fungible across different projects. So that's just a comment. The developer viability, I think, is an interesting one, but I think that you're going to have to put a little more thought into this because there are companies who go and you know or get projects going, go through the study process, and then sell them to other parties. There's a lot of acquisition activity, sometimes early on, sometimes later on. And so the question is, if a developer develops early stage projects and then sells to other parties, would you trace through and see if that project had eventually gotten to commercial operation or was under construction even by the new party that owns it? Or, you know, the whole idea of how does project acquisition, you know, buying and selling of projects and changing of hands, how does that get into the developer viability? Because just because the developer doesn't itself finish a project that it starts doesn't mean that they're not viable in terms of early stage developers. And just because somebody acquires a project that somebody else had started and then finishes it and puts it online, well, certainly they should be counted as a viable developer. So I think this will probably take a little more thought in terms of what happens if projects, you know, change hands somewhere along the way. So anyway, those are just a couple of observations.
Thank you, Susan. We definitely have to think of that. I wonder if you wanted to add anything. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to add anything, Loic. I don't know if Jean has left the call.
No, I think, I mean, those are good points. I mean, the entire in that presentation is to give you a broad picture. We do acknowledge that, a clear refinement of those criteria, and as mentioned this morning, that allowed some of a binary selection by the ISO is going to be critical. So the devil is in the detail. Those are just big concepts, but you're making good points that should be considered for those two criteria.
Okay, let's move to Kathleen Colbert with Vistra Corp.
Okay, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks to the SCE team, you put forward a lot of a few different things to think about. If it's all right, I'm gonna just focus on the general concept of the LSE interest and maybe go back to slide 2 or 3. I can't remember where exactly that is. Keep going back. Yeah, this is fine. Okay, so your general concept of kind of tweaking the LSE interest to make it workable. First, we completely agree with you that an executed PPA is unreasonable at this state, but we also think that really the other contracting status elements are also unreasonable to expect at this point in time as well. So I'm going to focus more on, and hope we have that clarity discussion later, but your new suggestion. LSEs are allocated a limited number of points based on load share. So as the Vistra team took a step back and thought about the LSE interest piece in the last month or so, we've kept coming back to a few things. If we were to do something more, so like this idea that you put forward, if you do get a share of points, how do you then allocate it to projects requires an additional activity. So if we were to kind of move forward with the concept that you put on the table, a next step would be a joint workshop with the CPUC and the CAISO to talk through what is a competitive process that could be set up to allow all projects to be, reflected and shown to an LSE with some amount of information that you could make that assessment on the allocation of those points to would be needed. So that's just a large lift that I'm noting that as a next step, if this does move forward in any way, we need to move down the path of what is a non-discriminatory way to implement that once you have those points to specific projects, and to ensure CAISO makes sure to make transparent enough information for you to be able to make that allocation at this stage. Like, for instance, I'm not sure how you can make that allocation, even if we set up a competitive process, either at the CAISO or at the CPUC or other LRAs, unless you're given some indicative cost information. And let me stop there and see if you have a response to that. Have you thought through the next steps of how, once you would have those points, we would perform some kind of non-discriminatory competitive process to figure out which projects it would be allocated to and what information you would need?
And I think to the point you made a bit earlier, or somebody made a bit earlier, I mean, it's going to be dependent of how much information is made available prior to, such as, location, capacities, and potentially broad overall costs for the network upgrade required for, to provide the offer capacity in that specific location. So we'll have a set of data. I mean, I think the intent here, beyond that, was certainly, and somebody mentioned that a bit earlier, the timing is going to be critical here. I think was next era probably on, are we going to be soliciting, are we going to have open procurement or activity in parallel with those, cluster? Timing is going to be everything on understanding, what project we may need, prior to a cluster opening. But to the extent that we have that guidance and direction, certainly will need to be provided, to your points, a subset of the information submitted as part of the IR request, so that we can make that assessment. It will be based on counterparty reaching out, and then people that we have engagement and relationship with as well, mean, so it's going to be an array of elements and location where they provided, and technology that are applicable. So, let me give you a specific example, which is a concern of ours as well. Is to the extent that we
can I give you a specific? Can I give you an example, and can you work with that?
Sure.
Okay, great. So my example would be a utility developer is preparing a project to submit into the next interconnection window, and it is going through and firming up its IR package. It submits that into the CAISO's market, or the CAISO IR window, and it closes, and that project has submitted all of the documentation that it has at that point in time. So the example that I'd like to see you work through is for the project to have submitted this information, they would need to know that by the IR window, right?
They would need to, sorry, they would need to know, what would they need to know? Sorry, these, whether they're going to be the recipient of those LSC bonus points?
Yeah, so the LSC bonus points you're proposing, for it to work out, and this is why I think it's good for you to think through this, is it's not a part of the scoring rubric because the scoring rubric is tied to projects. You would need to be receiving, let's say, points to allocate at will before the interconnection request window so that it could be allocated to projects, right? So if you start with you're prior to an interconnection request window, you've now been allocated some points. Now what do you do? In a way that is non-discriminatory, right? So the important thing is, my example is I'm a non-utility developer, and I need to know what open process exists for me to submit my project to have a fair opportunity to compete for these points. So how do you envision that open and fair process being set up?
Oh, this is Gene with SE. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm wondering if there's maybe some confusion as to what maybe like the process or the steps. I think we were envisioning that this LSE selection or LSE point allocation process would actually occur in a rapid fashion or fairly quickly after the interconnection requests have been provided to the CAISO. Because it could be as, I mean, the process could be as simple as the interconnection requests are submitted pursuant to the normal process or whatever process, and then that information is in turn provided to LSEs or interested LSEs, who then would turn around and provide this point allocation process currently, while the CAISO is also scoring the rest of, checking on the remaining scoring items that are on the list. And so it could be as simple as the LSEs get, a zip file or something like that with, I mean, I don't know how much information is in there, but with information on the projects from the interconnection request, and then they huddle back and meet and discuss, potentially which projects are of interest. I mean, that being said, as SCE, also has discussions with counterparties, and as most folks on the phone know, I mean, we have just kind of regular discussions with counterparties on a frequent basis, where we talk about projects as well. So I mean, that's not, I don't think that that occurs with our concurrent with our own RFO processes, and there's no sort of like issue with that. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
No, I think that's very helpful. So like one thought back is that an interconnection, a lot of information in the interconnection request package is confidential. So I'm a non-utility developer unaffiliated with your LSE. I've submitted an interconnection request to this window, right? That information is confidential except for what is made available on the public queue. So just one tweak of, I assume in this concept, we are holding near and dear to our hearts that no information that isn't available on the public queue is made available to the load serving entities, because that would result in an asymmetry of information again between different market participants, and that undermines competition. And I know we all don't want that, so like I'm confident we're on the same page there.
I mean, I think this would be something that would have to be discussed in the workshops potentially. I mean, if that's what the greater community wants, we could talk about that. If the greater community also wanted, was comfortable with LSEs also signing on to confidentiality, I can't speak for everyone as well, obviously. Certainly a topic to be discussed, I would think.
Yeah, that's fair. Can I propose an alternative for you to consider that I think would be easier to implement, but that achieves your goal, I think? But I'd like to hear your feedback on it.
Sure.
So then we've been doing a lot of thinking about the fact that the LSE, like how LSE interest is impacting our process, our planning processes. And part of a concern that we've been raising is that we don't want the Kaiser rules to put the thumb on a commercial activity. You're mentioning things that happened today. That's all fine and well, informal conversations, but that doesn't give us the greatest level of competition, right? But what we're not talking about is that there's a whole bunch of planning processes that happen in advance where load serving entities' interest is submitted confidentially and some publicly, but some version of mix to the CPUC. And the CPUC uses that information as its basis for building out its preferred system portfolio. That preferred system portfolio, of course, is a function of our modeling, right? Our IRP modeling that we use, which includes the load targets, includes some major transmission limits, includes our greenhouse gas goals. It includes generic resources. I mean, it's really the workhorse. It is the engine that has the complexity to kind of get us to a preferred system portfolio with the preferred resource type and transmission zone, that combination of resource type and transmission zone, that as a result, that sets our PSP. That work takes 2 years, as y'all know, and it's really important. And your interest and your information feeds into that. And so the resource type and the transmission zone combinations, that is actually a direct result of impacts of LSE interest, right? So my alternative I'd really like you to consider that I think will be easier to implement but achieve this goal on the concept of making sure that points have been allocated to load needs is that there be points associated with these combinations. So the resource type transmission zone, if it is in the portfolio at that location, you get a certain amount of points. If it's at the substation, you get maybe even more points at a more granular level of mapping. That is something super transparent, publicly available, everybody would understand, and it is informed by LSE interest. And so if you wanted to provide that information or in the CPUC, and if other LRAs want to take that approach and provide those similar kind of portfolios, I think that's the concept of the CAISO's proposal for non-CPUC entities, but I've deferred to them to confirm that. We'd strongly like to ask for your feedback on if this gets us there and if what the CAISO thinks as well, but I'd like to put that on the table.
So this is Jamie with SCE again. I mean, so I think I understand what you're getting at, which is essentially, even prior to this process, if I could paraphrase perhaps, even prior to this, the system planning process already contains sort of like LSE, LSE, how LSE or the state as a whole, wants the portfolio to look like, in a fair amount of detail. And so why shouldn't, basically the interconnection process mirror that to some extent? I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but, why wouldn't that be the basis for study, which I think I mean, there's a certain, I can't deny a certain amount of logic there. I mean, I think we've seen scenarios which I can't, or won't really go into detail about, but where, the sort of like that's a very, that's more kind of like a theoretical sort of like, well, we want the portfolio to look like this, or we want, things to map out in this manner. But then when you kind of get down to like where the rubber meets the road and like actual project implementation and timelines and locations and technologies, the solution, and we're still fairly early on in this whole process. I mean, I know it's been some years, but I think on the grand scale of things, I think that's still fairly early on in the process. But where sometimes like the reality of projects that are able to meet, with all the conditions in a timely fashion, like don't match exactly what the portfolio had thought or had requested. And I know that's a very vague statement, but maybe
no, I understand what you're.
So if I could just kind of say in closing, like I think what we're trying to do here is, I mean, so interest from an off-taker or off-taker interest is, just cutting to the chase. I mean, like, it's a secure long-term off-take agreement. I mean, when we recognize that as a big step in ensuring that the project moves forward. And I think that what we were trying, and the proposals that we've seen so far, or the information that we've seen so far, is basically trying to set criteria that would kind of like match. Well, if it has these criteria, then that means that it's of more interest to an off-taker. Whereas I think what we were putting forward here is sort of like, well, if you're really interested in interest from an off-taker, why not just ask the off-takers, to kind of make those suppositions. It just seemed like a more direct way to do it. But certainly
so that's a great question, and if I can, I just want to respond to your question.
I do think we need to move.
I have one
along.
comment, and then I'm going to cede the floor. I'm going to cede the floor in 1 second. But he asked a really important question. Why don't we want to do that? And it's in the pursuit of competition. And we want to make sure that projects are brought forward and made available for competition across all buyers. So just keep that in mind. And yes, I know I am ceding the floor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to Jason Buren with GridStore.
You all hear me?
Go ahead, Jason. Yes.
Great, thank you. No, thank you for this proposal to the team at Southern California Edison. I think that the project attributes piece here makes perfect sense, that you'd want things aligned with procurement orders and then can get online. I think the one question for clarification I'd ask SCE is, are those the online dates proposed in the interconnection request, and is there a process by which those dates would be sort of judged to be viable or not? I think that's one of the sort of the questions that comes with adding in the online date, because the project attributes can be clearer and assessed. For the expansion of an operational facility, I think we agree that expansion of an existing facility is probably not worth being nearly as merited as something that has known spare capacity. I think my question for that would be to SCE, what's going to be most supportive of what's intended here, which is a proxy for sort of project viability or speed. I would think that something like proximity to a substation is probably more important than expansion of an existing facility, but I'd be curious if you all have thoughts on that. And then the final comment is on the developer viability scores. I'm deeply concerned that those are, while well-intentioned, are going to have very unintended consequences and are hard to implement. For one, there are many technologies that California is trying to bring in, like offshore wind and long-duration storage and hydrogen, and those are things that have not been constructed by any companies yet. Similarly, is there a bounding to this construction by a company outside of the California footprint for in? But most importantly, and I think most significantly, the closing of the door to new entrants into a market is a very serious step. And I think that this is something that should be deeply concerning, particularly given that there are already so many other screening criteria here that should accomplish the goal of winnowing the queue, that adding on additional ones that have the distinct sort of proxy of basically incumbency should be avoided if, and only resorted to as an absolutely last circumstance. Thank you.
I think we can. I'd invite other folks from the team as well, from the SE team to weigh in as well. I mean, some of this stuff is just sort of my thoughts. I mean, we had a discussion of. I'll say that internally we had a discussion sort of like we had a discussion on all of these things, obviously, but as far as the fidelity of the online dates, I think we fully recognize that, at this early in the stage, things are going to change, and I mean, that's part of the purpose of the interconnection study process, is to try and determine some of these things. So I think you recognize that. But I think, well, first of all, let me preface all of this by saying, like, all of this is up for discussion, and we're already having a healthy discussion on it. I'm sure we will. I think from our perspective, it seemed like this is something that you would want to consider, because the timing for a lot of these requirements and procurements is, very key. And so, I think it's to be discussed, what the fidelity of the analysis on, whether the online date could be met or not is, we can, or if it just basically comes from what the applicant proposed in their connection request. I mean, that could be as well. And so it could just be another sort of like check. I think also you had mentioned sort of like, well, isn't the sort of like proximity to a substation, isn't that a better sort of metric? Again, can be discussed. I've certainly seen certain circumstances where, projects that did have a long gen timeline, it was a fairly straightforward path, and, all the requirements and right of ways, weren't an issue, and that was actually not the difficult part of the project. And then in addition, just because something is close to a substation, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's available capacity at the substation either. And so there's certainly different ways you could slice this and different components that you could put in, but we kind of took a stab at it. And then as far as the developer experience, I mean, we're, I would say we are aligned in wanting as much potential capacity out there as possible. It's a trade-off, right? Because we want to open it up, but then ultimately, these projects have to get online. I mean, we're talking about reliability efforts. So, how far do you open up the aperture, and to unproven sort of entities? I think it's a balance to some extent. So, welcome comments as far as like whether the aperture has been closed too far or not.
Just maybe two additional comments. One is that this criteria around off-taker, background and so on is existing in SE current RFO process. When we seek offer, we do consider, you know, the actual off-taker from a perspective of what they've done in the past. Again, I want to be cautious when we say those are not binary. You know, it's not you in, you out. It's just they're a small amount of points in a broader scoring system. So it's not, just want to be cautious in saying this is not a, you know, a gating criteria, it's just a scoring criteria. And then as Jean mentioned, I think that this is open to discussion. We try to push forward concept. I mean, the approach we took looking at those criteria was maybe a bit different and some of other based on discussion we had this morning. We didn't want to go with drastic change and saying nothing work, for the lack of a better term, but rather try to work with what put forward and kind of looking at one that we had concern and then refining those. So that was the approach. There's many ways to get at it. We, you know, because of the work that had been done and put forward by the CARESO, we wanted to kind of use that as a foundation and try to expand out of it.
Real quick, just a quick time check. We have about less than 10 minutes and about 6 other hands raised. So I want to make sure we get through those before we switch to the next proposal. I think Jason might have had a follow-up question, but event producer, can you see if we can unmute his line? I see his.
Hi, thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, no, thank you for the thoughtful reply. I think, you know, for the procurement order dates, that seems like something I'd be interested to see worked out into something definitive, because the last thing we want to do is have people propose very short dates just to get in and then not be able to deliver them. And then on the developer viability, I do want to note here that while I understand that this is considered one of many criteria that are being proposed, I think that it's important to realize that these decisions are going to be made on the margin when many of these criteria can be accomplished, for example, by developers. And so differentiating on incumbency is, I'd say, a very difficult territory to go into. The fact that SCE has this as an internal criterion for its contracting seems like that is indeed the right place for these kinds of things, rather than an ISO process that is at least aspirationally committed to open access. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. I think you unmuted. All right. So bear with me while we try to get through the next set of questions and comments. Let's move to Lauren Carr from CalCCA.
I just wanted to put in CalCCA's support for further developing the LSE bonus points concept in the sub-working groups. It's quite similar to a concept that CalCCA supported in our round of comments, so we appreciate CE bringing it forward here in the working group process. I think something like the bonus points concept is appropriate for the timing that the scoring criteria would take place. And it would be a good way to kind of get some more granularity around LSE interest, where there can be kind of a range of points assigned based on how interested an LSE is in a particular project. So just wanted to put in our support for further developing this concept and thank SE for bringing it forward.
All right, thank you, Lauren. Eddie Dadashti with Pars Energy, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I have two general questions, a comment and a question. And first comment has to do with slide number 6, SE, slide number 6. And that has to do with long lead order of equipment like transformers. Again, I'm going to second what Susan Schneider said, and that is that a development company is not the builder of the plant. So it may change several owners before it actually goes to construction. And then they have to go to a financing organization to finance the construction. And that's not going to happen unless the project has an interconnection agreement and all the environmental work has been done. So I disagree with having this long lead equipment to be a metric in evaluation of the bids. My actual question is from Edison. What would be your reaction if some of these scores would be pass-fail and not really a number? Let's say a letter of interest that you have from the off-taker, 20 points. You either have it or you do not. Why not put it pass-fail? I would appreciate your thoughts on this.
I don't know if we actually really thought about. I mean, so first of all, I don't know if we really actually specifically, pose that question internally. I'd be interested to, I mean, the original point system was from the CAISO.
Yes.
I'd be interested to hear some of their thoughts as to, I think we were just kind of carrying the water along there. I mean, my initial reaction would be sort of like, since this is a relatively new process, what we're basically what the process is trying to ensure, to my understanding of how this has been structured, is sort of like a weighting or a grading system to create the cutoff for the study process. And then but you want the resource. We want the resources, obviously, because we need we need the resources. And if you have just like a pass fail, there's some kind of danger that like we've structured this inappropriately and like everyone fails, and then there's that would obviously be sort of like a, no pun intended, a failure. Then that would be my sort of initial thoughts.
Yeah, and I think this morning was discussed. All projects are going to be quite different at different stage. So I don't think you can have a pass fail for those criteria. Literally, you may find different paths to have a successful project and across project territory and LSCs and developer. You may find a different path that still make the project viable. So I think the scoring approach is reasonable from that perspective. I mean, if we think that some area are like, if we think that some area are extremely desirable, then certainly the scoring, the point system can be increased. So it's not a pass fail, but it make it critical maybe. But that's kind of the extent of where we would like that to go.
Yeah, the danger I see that we could run into, that is, if somebody disputes, is grading. One project gets 15, the other one gets 20. We may end up getting a lot of disputes, much more than you bargained for. So again, this is a brainstorming session. I'm just wanted to plant the seed with all of you to think about. Maybe a portion of the scoring would be pass-fail, and a portion would be numbers and graduated scales.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you.
Let's move to Jerry Melcher with Public Advocate's Office.
Morning, this is Jerry Melcher with the Public Advocate Office. Loic, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So the question I have is on this proposal is, how does this Edison proposal address non-CPUC jurisdictional LSE projects such as those from SCAPA or 6 cities that are, one, self-developed, or two, secured individually or as a joint agency through an RFP and tendered PPA with 100% site control?
I mean, I think the comment that was made a bit earlier as well is regardless of, you know, the procurement mechanism, I mean, because we have a finite amount of, you know, allocation from a CAISO perspective, I think every project should compete on its own ground. I mean, so there may be a rubric and a category and a point system for such project, but there should not be, I think, bypassing the entire queue. I mean, that was, I think that was a concern that was raised by some, you know.
I'm not sure why, you know, such a project couldn't, you know, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but couldn't also be, some of these scoring criteria could also be applied.
Well, you know, we currently have independent study process. We have fast track process, and you know, if I recall, Edison implemented several energy storage projects recently as part of the CPUC mandated emergency reliability rulemaking. So when the capacity is there and the CAISO is identifying capacity availability, and you've already checked all the boxes to make the project viable, shouldn't it just go forward and get that capacity?
Why? I mean, I think Edison did not specifically do that. I mean, those projects that you're referring to are not taking, you know, are not using CAISO interconnection or transmission capacity per se. So I think the challenge is what we've heard a bit earlier is that it kind of put those projects, you know, at an unfair advantage over other. And yes, they may score really high to your points in that scoring criteria and may be allocated, but we don't see why they would not be scored as any other project to see if indeed they are as viable as other, you know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to Lisa Dowden. Go ahead, Lisa, you're unmuted.
Okay, I'm sorry, you can hear us? Okay. Yes, Lisa Dowden for the Northern California Power Agency. I guess I have a comment and a question. First of all, though, I do appreciate the SCE proposal. You've taken a lot of time to think about sort of upfront ways to deal with LSE interest, which is a goal NCPA supports, because we want to make sure that the projects that are needed to meet the mandates are the ones that are actually developed. Folks have been asking about the non-CPUC LSE jurisdictional study aspect of the proposal. Obviously, we don't speak for CAISO. Our NCPA's interest in the proposal stems from the fact that originally, when the proposal was strictly tied to the CPUC, CEC, CAISO MOU, it was focused on something that those particular LRAs are excluded from, they're not parties to, and focused on the CPUC planning process, which also does not reflect us. We appreciate CAISO's willingness to include us in the planning process, but there are still questions about how that's going to work. For example, the exact mechanism for submitting our plans. And there's also a timing question. Is the next TPP that will have our input going to be finished in good time to form the basis of the next cluster, or is the next cluster still not going to include our input? But even with inclusion in planning, we still need to make sure that the projects get built and that they satisfy the requirements we have to meet. And that can be hard when you are small. A common experience for NCPA when issuing an RFP is there are folks out there with very big projects, and NCPA can't take, you know, certainly can't take the whole project, and not even a greater part of it. And so we do run into some difficulties sometimes getting access to projects when our interests are small. With that in mind, one of our initial reactions to SCE's proposal and the point allocation was how that would work for an entity like NCPA, whose resources and loads are scattered across Northern California and in a number of different zones, including a couple of members that aren't in a zone at all, although with any luck, you know, that will change in future. In other words, we could certainly see a situation where we would want to say add capacity to an existing resource when we wouldn't have any load in that zone. And if the proposal is tied to load ratio share of load in the zone, that wouldn't help us very much. And so we would need to see a little more flexibility in that proposal, I think, before we could support it. But overall, we think SCE has made a number of good proposals here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to Chris Devon with TerraGen.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Chris with TerraGen.
Yes.
Thanks. So I realize we're pressed for time. I'm going to try to go quickly here. I just wanted to express our opposition to, you know, this expansive LSE interest addition to the proposal. I think we support the idea in general of using LSE interest, and we would agree and concur with others' views that have been raised and discussed earlier about how the IRP properly does that. I think I would also support the idea that Vistra proposed to maybe use other IRP criteria as opposed to this additional LSC points concept. I think we would be concerned with open access and competition related issues and just additional complexity that this would create. We also believe that doing a load ratio type share would unfairly favor larger LSEs. And it seems that this addition of another bonus point criteria for LSE interest would further give more negotiating power to the LSEs and reduce competition. So for all those reasons, I think we would oppose this concept. I think we appreciate the idea and you know the hope that SCE had in developing further proposals on this. And so lastly, I'll just say that if CAISO is going to go down this path and try to, you know, develop this idea of some kind of additional points for LSE selection, I think we would really need to work on the idea of what are the cost estimates in general that could be used by the LSEs, because it seems like at this point in the process, they won't have any cost estimate at all, which is some of the points that were raised by others earlier, including Calwea and Vistra. And I think that we would concur with that. And the other idea of the, you know, online dates and validating the online dates and having some kind of repercussions if those aren't, you know, actual reality or very, you know, appropriate online dates that are being used in these kind of, you know, LSE scoring concepts. I think that those things should be discussed, you know, in more detail if we're going to go down this path. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Chris. So I think that's all we have for time on this topic. I know we have a few hands raised. Let's connect offline and hopefully we can continue this discussion. And thanks again to everyone from SCE for presenting today.
Thank you.
All right, event producer, can we please move to slide 15? All right. Danielle, did you want to just touch on the scoring rubric and the details? Any final comments before we move on to the interconnection caps?
Yeah, can you all hear me okay? Checking.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think the only thing I wanted to say, we'll plan to jump into the specifics of the scoring rubric
on the 2nd, if that works for everyone. I want to make sure that everyone who's prepared to give a presentation today on the interconnection caps has a chance to do so. But I think both on the scoring rubric and Edison's proposal, for people who, if there were still hands raised and people who have kind of outstanding questions, we really want to encourage you to do some outreach and coordination offline, and see if you can get the answers and share feedback that you need to share between now and the 2nd, so that we can come back on the 2nd with kind of overarching feedback on Edison's proposal and other changes that we might make or consider making to the scoring criteria. So we'll defer right now jumping into the scoring rubric and just go to the interconnection caps piece, but plan on taking it up next week on the 2nd. And at the end of this conversation, we're going to also spend some time thinking through topics and agendas for the next 2 working groups too. So just get your thoughts ready on that so we can take feedback at the end.
All right, are you ready to move into the next presentation?
Yeah, if whoever is presenting, I think it's AES, but whoever's presenting should go ahead whenever they're ready.
All right, thank you. So Jasmine Guan and Bridget Sparks, our event producer, is in the process of moving you over to panelists. And then once we have, I think we're just missing Bridget Sparks here. So once you're ready to go ahead and queue up the next slide.
All right, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity here to discuss the developer cap proposal. On the line here, my name is Jasmine. I'm the Senior Specialist in Interconnection Policy at AES, and also Bridget Sparks, who's the Manager of Interconnection Policy. We are here presenting on the behalf of a group of developers today on the developer cap proposal. Next slide, please. So the following presentation that we are going to discuss today was developed and also endorsed by AES, NextEra Resources, Rev Renewables, Clearway Energy Group, and NG North America. Next slide, please. So just to give a recap of what the developer cap proposal was in the Schwab proposal. In the Schwab proposal, the CAISO proposes that each developer to only be limited to submitting 25% of applications of based off the available transmission across the CAISO's footprint. They stated that this would be applied at the parent company level. And some of the observations we got from the September 28th stakeholder meeting was that the purpose of the developer cap would be to prevent market power by limiting the potential for a small group of developers to kind of take over the queue process, and that the concern was that these developers would be the only ones negotiating RA contracts and as a result increase RA pricing. So we wanted to take today's time to kind of discuss this proposal and some of the concerns that this group will be bringing forward that we have. So next slide, please. And Bridget, go ahead.
Thanks, Jasmine. So our first concern is that the CAISO hasn't provided any indication that market power actually exists or even has the potential. And also, they haven't provided a clear definition of what they mean by market power in this instance. There was some indication, and the group is sort of assuming that CAISO means market power in terms of RA pricing and being able to exert undue rents from the RA prices. So first off, again, CAISO has not defined what market power is within the interconnection queue. And we think there's sort of a disconnect between the queue, which is what we're talking about here and in this initiative, versus an actual RA market, which is sort of separate and bilateral between developers and off-takers. And so first off, we want to ask the CAISO to clarify, when you discuss market power, are you talking about increased RA prices? And then secondly, the CAISO has not provided any data to support this concern. nor did it support that the 25% cap is the right number. And so our chief concern is that this is a hypothetical issue that hasn't materialized, nor may never materialize. And so devising a solution for a problem that doesn't actually exist is premature. So one thing to keep in mind is there's a very easy formula to determine market concentration. It's the HHI index, which is basically where you take everybody's percent of the market. So percent of products in the queue, megawatts in the queue, and square it. And then anything above 2,500 is considered highly concentrated. And I just think we have enough developers that I don't see this actually getting high enough to actually materialize into one firm sort of monopolizing the queue. And so again, there's very easy data and a metric that the CAISO could use in the future to monitor if this actually becomes a problem. Next slide. So our second concern is around open access and preferential treatment. So we think that the way that this is applied currently is discriminatory between independent power producers and utility-backed generation. Non-CPUC jurisdictional LRAs are automatically accepted into the queue without capping and inclusive of the 150% available transmission cap. IPPs who are subject to the developer cap and scoring criteria within the 150% are treated differently than the non-CPUC jurisdictional LRAs, which is a very clear example of preferential treatment. And we don't think that this would pass the open access test at FERC. Additionally, no other entity has a developer-specific cap. While MISO had explored it in their recent queue reforms, they have since dropped it on the basis of discriminatory treatment. And all LRAs are now able to submit unlimited applications. Oh, since the LRAs similarly could be prioritized above the cap. So again, it shows that there's this differential treatment between entities, which again, we think is violating FERC principles. So MISO has dropped that proposal and may revisit in the future, again, if this actually becomes a problem. And so we think it's premature and again, discriminatory to move forward with this proposal. Next slide.
Okay. And then the next concern that we have is regarding the administrative burden in determining the parent company. So the proposal proposes to cap the 25% of the submitted applications at the parent company level. But we want to just have CAISO be wary of the administrative burden to determine these parent companies because of the fact that companies have different structures, such as a joint venture, that's going to be really difficult to determine who the parent company is and calculate the cap. So that's another thing that we think will add additional time that's not necessarily needed in the interconnection process. Next slide, please. And finally, our concern here, or just a thought, is that the site control requirements per the FERC Order 2023, which is requiring 90% of site control at the generating facility at the time of application, will already, I think, transform and limit the number of applications that are eligible to enter the scoring process. So we think with the increased site control and the scoring process, we don't see the need for an additional developer cap to be added, given the other concerns that we just stated. And then, thank you. We can go to the next slide for our recommendations.
So our recommendations is that the CAISO should remove the developer cap at this point and address this in a future stakeholder process if data supports that market power, market concentration has occurring or has the potential to occur. Additionally, we think if CAISO is really concerned about RA prices, then we think that option B reforms are the more appropriate mechanism to address this potential issue. So really, the reasons why you'll get higher RA prices in the future is because of supply constraints that the CAISO is artificially creating through the 150% cap. And so allowing option B projects to interconnect not only in outside of priority zones, but also within priority zones would be a potential check on these high RA prices through additional market supply. So the idea is, option B projects have to self-fund all of their upgrades without reimbursement, meaning they need a higher RA price to recuperate those costs. So to the extent that RA prices increase, more projects would be likely to choose option B because they know they could get that RA price. Once there's more supply, LSCs have more options, which means they can lower the prices. And so we think this is sort of a natural mechanism and check against higher RA prices in the future, again, due to this supply constraint, not due to a limited number of developers in the queue. We think it's more of a potential supply issue in the future, not a concentration amongst any specific developers. So with that, we will open up to questions and feedback from the working group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If anyone has questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand. I don't see any at this time, so let's give it a minute. Bob or Danielle, I don't know if any comments.
Yeah, this is Bob. I just kind of want to respond to the market power discussion, and the term market power was used pretty loosely, and it wasn't necessarily related to RA pricing. More of a concern of just large developers might be able to tie up more land and submit more projects related to having site exclusivity and other mechanisms or site control that might give them some level of kind of buying their way into the market where other smaller developers may not have the same ability to do, go out and procure as much land. That's just one example, but it's more just a concern that we want to make sure that, first of all, we do want to limit the number of projects that we get into the queue, into the most ready projects. And if one developer, I think it's unlikely that, 25% is just a number that we threw out that we thought was appropriate. It's open for discussion, but to leave it open to where you have no limitations and someone could actually seek to get it all. And, that's kind of not, I don't know that that's a realistic scenario, but we were concerned that certain developers might be able to take certain actions that would limit the competition from other projects. So I just wanted to clarify, it wasn't really related to the RA pricing market power thinking.
Thank you, Bob. We do have a hand raised from Ryan Millard with Next Era. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ryan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me? There's a delay.
Yes.
Perfect. Appreciate that clarification, Bob. I guess where I would still question it though is I don't know that a fear that's not measurable is still worth pursuing such a defined cap that introduces a whole level of concern about competition, which I think we tried to outline in this PowerPoint. Moreover, if you have a particular developer where that is the case, is that a reflection of just a competitive outcome, or is that your perception that they have some unfair advantage? I think that that's problematic to view it at this point. And I think proactively adopting measures that are so restrictive introduces a whole another level of concern, which Bridget and Jasmine have outlined here.
Yeah, just building off of Ryan's point, it just seems really outlandish that any one developer, especially with the way that land competition is playing out in California right now, that I don't think even the biggest market players have the capex to really buy up all the land and concentrate the queue in this way. So I think there's a lot of external forces that are going to constrain any one developer or even the like top 2 or 3 from investing so much capex in one market. You know, a lot of the big players were across the country, and so we're trying to decide between, you know, do we develop in CAISO, MISO, PJM, the non-RTO regions, and so most of the big players are nationwide, and I just don't think they would try to corner the CAISO market to such a degree that you're concerned about. And I think there's a lot of, again, we just think it's unnecessary to put this cap at this point for a problem that's hypothetical that you haven't shown is realistic. And such an amorphous definition of market power too also is problematic in my mind, because I think what CAISO is really worried about is, you know, you worry about concentration in the market because you worry about prices increasing monopolistically. And again, there's a very easy and clear data formulas to quantify that objectively. And so I think we should rely on objective measures rather than just sort of hypothetical gut instincts. And again, if after a Q or two, if it does look like there are starting to be concentrations amongst a handful of developers, then I think CAISO would also have the data to justify such a cap. And so we just think that if you're moving forward with the scoring criteria, you know, there's like, we're going to have to pick our favorite projects and really invest in those to increase the points to ensure that they get studied. And so I think with the scoring criteria, with site control, I just am highly, highly skeptical that the hypothetical issue that you're concerned about will ever materialize. And again, I think we should wait for the data to do something so extreme as to severely and arbitrarily limit IPPs when you're not doing the same for other LRAs. And so I think the whole discriminatory treatment could at FERC also jeopardize the entire reform efforts. And we don't think it's worth the risk of some of the other improvements that we might be making through this initiative for something as controversial as a developer cap to stand. So I also note that in MISO's filing, they are separating out their increase in readiness requirements and are submitting their overall Q cap in a separate filing at FERC because they're worried about the potential FERC rejection of such an idea. So also something to think about.
Thanks, Bridget. Can I just ask, I don't think I see any hands in the queue still, but I'd be curious to hear if anybody feels differently. I think we've heard from the group of developers who oppose the cap, and maybe this is a difficult environment to raise your hand and say that you support it, but just wanted to get a sense of whether there are different perspectives out there or if there's kind of consistent and uniform concern around this element.
I do have a couple hands raised. So let's go to Eddie Dadashti with PARS Energy.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. I'm going to make a statement in support of ISO's decision on the market power. If you look at cluster 14 and 15, and you'll see some companies are putting in a request for 1,000 megawatts for a 230 kV substation, which can't possibly take that amount of power. And actually, I was actually preparing a application for a client that only had 100 megawatts, and that raised the cost so much that all the smaller projects dropped out. So there's that kind of a market power as well. It's not just how many applications you can submit, but there's different kind of gamings that can happen that needs to be stopped. So, but I do think that we need to further develop how to stop those games. Thank you.
All right, Lauren Carr with Cal CCA.
Hi, this is Lauren Carr from Cal CCA. Cal CCA supports the intent of the 25% cap to address market power, but we also understand the concerns expressed by developers about how the cap was set at 25%. And we think that maybe CAISO could do some work to assess what the right level of a cap would be by looking at past clusters or cluster 15 and seeing, what the right level of a cap would be. Maybe you'll find that 25% is necessary to prevent the potential for market power among developers, or maybe you'll find that the cap could be raised and still provide adequate competition. But either way, we support setting the cap at the right level to ensure adequate competition, but we think some more work could be done with past data or data that we already have to figure out what the right level of the cap would be. I'll also add that there's kind of another cap that is in play here, which is the 150% cap on the amount that the CAISO will study. And that's, on the other hand, causing a potential for reduced competition by limiting the number of projects studied within each zone. So we recommended considering raising that cap to increase competition in that way. So that's kind of where we are on it. Specific to the 25% cap, we're supportive of figuring out what the right level of a cap on the amount of requests a developer can submit would be. Thanks.
This is Jasmine. I was wondering if I can it seems like from hearing the past two comments that it's kind of unclear to the group of what is defined as market power by the CAISO. So what is the problem we're addressing? So I think it would be great to get more clarity on that. I think that would be helpful to, just set the baseline for this proposal in general. Thank you.
Yeah, Jasmine, we can try to do that. Beyond what Bob just said, are you suggesting, in terms of how we address this at the next working group meeting or potentially in the draft final proposal, or did you have something in mind?
Well, I think our recommendation is still consistent that we don't really see what the issue that is supported by data yet. So we still, our position is still that removing the cap at this time would be the most appropriate position. But I think we would be more open to hearing what the CAISO believes the issue of market power is to start off.
Okay, thanks. We'll take that back internally and figure out how we can better convey that.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to Doug Karpa with Peninsula Clean Energy. Doug,
Doug Carpo, Peninsula Clean Energy. Yeah, thanks for raising the issue. I think there's certainly some food for thought here. Not maybe a big surprise to hear us largely agree with CalCCA. I just, yeah, so it sounds a little bit like there's more development that needs to get done here about trying to come up with a mechanism to prevent market power. I did one of the proposals that kind of raised a little bit of concern is this notion of, hey, let's wait for like one or two clusters to go through, and if there's a market power problem, well, we'll do something then. You know, that's a pretty good chunk of time where the market would potentially be having serious issues. And so I'm wondering if we might take an approach like using one of the suggested metrics, if like CAISO or this group were to be able to decide on a metric that says like, yeah, when we get over a certain index, that's an indication there's too much concentration, and we need to do something. If we have that index, I wonder if the cap could be something more dynamic, where if the applications all come in, we analyze it, and then the index says, oh, there's a problem because it's over X number, then you apply a cap and say, hey, we're going to start removing projects from the biggest developer entity here until we're back under to a sufficiently low index number, and backfill with smaller developers and kind of address it in real time that way. So it's a it's a index triggered dynamic cap rather than like, oh, let's have a big problem develop and then solve it later. Just a small twist on what's already been mooted, but appreciate really what everyone has had to say on this issue. Thank you.
Can I respond to that? So, Doug, building off your point, there is an existing index that the US government uses in their antitrust litigations. And so it is the HHI index that I referenced. And the metric that they use is the market has to be concentrated. So it has to be over an HI index of 2,500. And then when they're reviewing mergers, if the merger increases the HHI by 200 points, then that's considered monopolistic. So there definitely are objective measures like that we could consider. And I think we'd be more comfortable with something like a methodology and focused more on actual selection of projects. So right now, the other problem with the developer cap is it's placed on number of applications, not on like what actually gets scored. So we think, again, that's another premature place in the process to limit it. Something like closer to only 25% of projects studied. So you actually have to get those high scores to get into the study. Or again, you could keep a running HHI index, and then as you're going through the scoring criteria, keep track of how this would increase any one market participant's concentration in the market. Again, this is very simple percents and squaring. You could easily build an automated tool in QPoint to do this. So I think we'd be more comfortable with something like a methodology that's actually tied to real time data, and again, using objective measures that are well established in these kinds of proceedings.
Thank you, Bridget. I think Brian might have muted himself, which is fine. So we really only have enough time for one more question, and then we need to move on. But Doug, I still see your hand raised. Let's unmute Doug and see if he had a. Okay, there we go. All right, let's take our last question from Ryan Millard with Next Era. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Just one more comment. The proposed gaming that the gentleman from PARS alluded to, assuming that example was true, and I think in that example it was a 1,000 megawatt project, wasn't viable and the 100 megawatt project was, I think that could be reflective of an already broken system where the barriers to entry are already far too low. And at the beginning of this IPE initiative, I think that was something that an overwhelming number of stakeholders would acknowledge right now. But what I think got overlooked and what Bridget and Jasmine highlighted is that if those are changing as part of this reform effort and in response to FERC Order 2023, you're adding another layer of restriction and what we would argue is an arbitrary layer that has the potential to cut competition off at the knees. So the bigger point here is you shouldn't institute a perceived fix to a problem that doesn't exist yet. And that's where I keep going back to. I recognize that folks think that it's too late if you wait, but it's also problematic if you implement a restriction for something that doesn't need to be there and doesn't exist yet. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, Bridget, Jasmine, any last remarks before we move on?
Thank you all for the time.
All right, thank you. And for folks who have their hand raised, we'll have our next working group meeting, or we'll connect offline. So we'll move on to the next slide. And thank you, Jasmine and Bridget, for presenting your proposal today. So before we go into next steps and close out the meeting, Danielle or Bob, did you want to just talk about topics for future working group meetings or any last minute thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I recognize we didn't really jump into the scoring rubric in the way that we had intended to today, but I think it was still a really helpful discussion and appreciate all of your feedback. I would recommend that that's what we do for the bulk of the working group meeting on November 2nd, but want to put that out to stakeholders for any additional ideas or topics that you feel need to be addressed in the working group setting. And maybe as you think that over, I'll just flag, we do have an all-day session scheduled currently for November 15th. I want to be really clear on expectations for that with all of you. We are going to be finalizing the draft final proposal at that point. So however we use that time, if you all want to use that time, I want to make sure you're all aware that that's going to be in the very late stages of developing the draft final proposal to get it through internal reviews and everything. So we're going to probably need to be pretty granular and focused for that working group. And so I want you to know that. But we're still open to having it. It's still scheduled, and we're curious to hear how you want to use the time. So any quick thoughts before we close?
Yeah, we have a hand raised from Ryan Millard. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So Danielle, I'm going to be totally transparent with you. I'm a little frustrated. I'm frustrated because the way that these work groups have been structured, it's been very difficult internally to get our development team into the meeting. There needed to be more pre-planning for this so that we could prepare and show up appropriately. We've just spent over an hour on just 2 criteria elements, neither of which seem particularly viable to us. And now you're telling us that on the 15th, you will have already been in the drafting of finalizing the proposal, and we're having a working group to discuss potentially scoring criteria that's not going to make it into the draft final proposal. Am I understanding that right?
No, I didn't say it's not going to make it in. I'm suggesting that we focus on kind of final tweaks around the edges to it.
So if the draft final proposal is still going to be on the 21st and we're having a working group on the 15th, how is anything that comes out of that going to make it into the draft final proposal substantively?
that is dependent on the feedback that we get from you and our ability to turn it around quickly, which we're working to do. This is a compressed time frame for everyone.
I recognize that, but I think it could have been managed a little bit better by having smaller working group sessions and having those scheduled far in advance, recognizing that you could always move a meeting if it didn't work out or you couldn't make that happen. I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts, but I'm very concerned about the compressed timeline now, and because I feel like we're still very far away from getting any kind of specificity or consensus on those elements. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's move to Bridget Sparks.
Thanks. One suggestion is it seems like this is taking so long because we have to sort of wait to get into the verbal queue. And it'd be really great if we could utilize the chat function to have more real-time reactions from more folks, or to, you know, make little suggestions that don't require like, oh, we support this, or what do you think about this? And so I'm wondering if for the next working group, if it'd be more expedient and productive to open up that chat function to allow participants and attendees to talk to one another. And then, you know, maybe have a moderator from CAISO who can, you know, help crystallize and bring up like, hey, I'm seeing a lot of support for X, to kind of help us crowdsource more quickly and expediently. And then also, when there's a general feeling of frustration too with the working group process, that it feels like we go through the whole working group and then the straw proposal looks like what you would predict based on like an issue paper. And so also the comment around like, oh, November 15th, like it may not really impact the draft final. It seems like CAISO isn't really giving enough time for the stakeholder process to work and are so wedded to a specific end timeline that and you're considering such a radical change in the way that the interconnection process is done. I mean, we took 4 years to do day-ahead market enhancements. You know, while EDAM went really quickly, there's still a lot of work there. And so I just feel like CAISO needs to be open to, okay, if it's not February, maybe taking 2 more months and doing it in April and asking for another tariff waiver. Like, we would rather get this right the first time than to rush through a process that has a lot of unintended consequences or hasn't been thoroughly thought through. Like, we haven't even gotten to the auction mechanism discussion, which is a totally untested, purely theoretical concept. And so we're just really concerned that you're rushing this, you're not giving enough time, and you're kind of moving forward with whatever the CAISO wanted to do in the first place, and these working groups are performative. So just wanted to voice that sort of, it just feels kind of disingenuous the way that we're like rushing through this. And I just think there's also some like structural changes with opening up the chat that could kind of help improve the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. And I just want to clarify too, a couple things. One, the meeting on the 2nd, and I believe also the meeting on November 15th are both in person and virtual. So hopefully that facilitates more idea sharing, and, you know, we can look at body language and things like that, show of hands, we can do that. We can open up the chat. We also have a polling feature that we can try to call on more often. So we hear you on that. I do want to clarify, the reason we're trying to move this forward so quickly is in large part, because we have cluster 15 that we want to re-engage with. So our expectation was that there was also a desire on behalf of stakeholders for us to get this filing, you know, keep it moving within the time frame and get it to the board and to FERC within the time frame that we've been working under. So if that's no longer the desire, then that is good to hear. And we'd encourage you to reach out if others feel like this is moving too quickly. I can just assure you, you know, between this and the compliance filing, we are spending a lot of days and nights and weekends thinking about this. And so I know the pace is exhausting and maybe a little bit, moves and fits and starts as we wait through comments and want to digest comments and things like that. But we're just really trying to push it as fast as we can for you, not because we don't care what you think. If we didn't care what you think, we wouldn't have scheduled these workshops and been asking you these questions. So there's definitely value to us from these workshops, and we hope that you continue to participate in them.
Thank you, Danielle. And I know we're a bit over time, but I think this was very valuable discussion. So we'll try to wrap it up quickly. I know we have a couple hands raised. So let's go to Jason Buren with GridStore.
Just two very quick things, Danielle. I appreciate what you guys are trying to do. I do think revisiting the timeline and pushback and understanding that may have pushbacks on other things is probably more important than rushing something this significant through. So I'll just throw my hat on that concept too. But I think the other thing is before the next meetings, something that might be helpful to the process maybe is three things. One, I encourage you to use tools to solicit input from stakeholders. I know that it's not always representative when you do that, but especially when it comes to things like scores and weighting, I think that you could use some interesting tools to get rapid feedback that helps inform where stakeholders are on criteria, recognizing that's quantitative, not qualitative. Two, I would hope that on the second, we can discuss the entire framework of scoring all together in one place, because I think taking it one by one misses that this is a portfolio of criteria, and hopefully that allows also the identity of things that might be, for example, earlier or later stage in the process to have some airing. And perhaps you can call on specific stakeholders to do the work to come with fully formed presentations. That's the third piece is maybe it's important to get a few things in here that are fully formed together so that we're responding to a package and not a single idea. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's move to Kathleen Colbert with Vistra.
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I support a lot of what my fellow colleagues have said already, so I won't repeat them. But I do want to make a very specific ask of the CAISO. In the spirit of trying to move things along and to be efficient, it is incredibly important that the CAISO provide a stakeholder comment matrix and then respond to the questions and comments that were submitted on the straw proposal before I think we can move forward. So I'm going to ask the CAISO, can you commit to providing a stakeholder comment matrix on the comments you received on the straw proposal and then respond and post the answers or responses to those questions and or comments?
Kathleen, why don't you let us take that back and get you an answer on that next week? I think that feeds into the bigger question of the timeline and what our ultimate deadline is for the draft final proposal. So if that's okay, we'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, of course. And you might find that there's lots of suggestions in there. So you asked for suggestions and feedback. I saw the scope of all of the comments. I think we need as a group to talk through them, and maybe there's things that make this easier, but we don't know until you summarize them and respond to them and we have a discussion on it. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that before we move forward on kind of the broader discussion. I'm not suggesting we don't continue the scoring rubric and the subgroup work, but to move this forward, that's going to be needed before any kind of additional proposal on a holistic level is discussed again, and we can keep working on this in parallel. I would note, Danielle, you kind of implied to me that you thought maybe there were changes around the edges of your scoring proposal, and I have to be honest that the feedback that I'm trying to provide is that it's the whole proposal needs to be reworked from the beginning in this workshop with people who have experience in development, helping you understand what can be achieved at the different gates. And we need to start doing actual work. And so whatever you can do to facilitate a workshop that allows for the stakeholders and developers to lead that conversation, to help define that work product, I think that's what's missing, and that's what we need to move towards. So appreciate it.
So along those lines, and I realize I think we have one more hand up. We are gonna, after we hear from Fernando, we're gonna ask for volunteers to kind of take a stab at a straw proposal or a refined straw proposal or something on the scoring rubric. So just think about whether you're maybe willing to volunteer for that. That's to all of you. But I'll hear the last comment first before we jump into that.
All right, Fernando, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Fernando with Southern California Edison. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, want to thanks again and for the CAISO to allow SE to provide our perspective at least and propose modifications to what was part of the CAISO straw proposal as it relates to the scoring system criteria. Grateful for the opportunity. Just in terms of next step, I'd like to kind of get the CAISO's reaction and maybe follow-ups here. Is the CAISO planning to have additional discussion on the SE sponsored modifications to the scoring system in terms of having dedicated time set aside during the subsequent workshop, or kind of what are the next steps, and if there's any initial reactions that the CAISO can share to what SE presented today, that would be helpful as well. But just want to kind of get a sense in terms of as far as what we did today, how that would be incorporated into the overall process and how we can help facilitate the further discussion that we really appreciated having the dialogue with stakeholders today. We thought we got some really good feedback, good insights, good questions that makes us think a little bit further about our proposed scoring system. And so just want to see what the follow-up may be in the next steps on this item. Would appreciate any thoughts you would have on that, Danielle.
Yep, thanks, Fernando. That was the second piece. So I was going to ask if it might be possible for you to organize a subgroup outside of these formal working groups just in the next month or in the next week. It doesn't have to be formal, but just to take some of the feedback you heard today, maybe do some outreach to others who had comments who may not have been able to state them on the line because of our format of the call. But if you could maybe come back with a slightly revised portfolio or proposal that reflects some of that feedback, that would be great. And if there are volunteers on this call who want to talk to you in the interim to help you with that, I think now would be a good time maybe to have them put their hands up. And that way there can be some interim work being done so that when we come back to this on the second, we can start not from where we left off today, but maybe from however far you get in the next few days.
Thanks, Dale. That would be helpful. Maybe a more efficient way of doing with it if interested stakeholders would like to have additional conversation, additional thoughts, input into the SE sponsored modified scoring system proposal. Maybe the folks could send me an email and I'll coordinate with internally here with our procurement folks to make sure that they're engaged and that we can have whatever discussions can take place, recognizing that it is going to be a challenge to work, in some kind of a coordinated fashion within the next week or so timeframe. But I'm not sure if it's possible just to give my email now. Folks can send notes or just raise your hand at that time indicating their willingness and desire to participate, and I'd be glad to share that with the internal team.
Fernando, if you want to just type your email into the chat to all panelists, I can share it with the attendees in the chat, or you can just say it aloud now also.
I'll type it in the chat. Thanks.
All right, that's all we had for questions. Danielle?
So I did want to ask if anyone is willing to kind of head a subgroup in the next week or so, just to have a couple of conversations. I think the ISO team is able to join if you want us there or not, but to take a stab at redlining the scoring criteria, just to have a starting point for the next working group meeting. And yeah, so ideally it wouldn't be your individual company's ideal redlining of the scoring criteria, but sort of a balanced sub-working group input. Is anyone interested in taking part in that process?
I'm not seeing any. Okay. Jason Viren with GridStore and Renee Steichen with Rev Renewables are saying they're happy to try or to be part of that.
That would be great. And I'll say too, if you need our help or support in just listening and participating or documents or things like that, we're happy to do that.
Okay. Fernando, I see your hand raised. Did you have any other comments?
No, I'll take it down. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right, Danielle, anything else?
No, thank you all. We hear your concerns. We're trying to get this right. So hopefully we can all just keep working together. If there are any changes to our process, we'll try to make you aware of them as quickly as we possibly can. And we do really want this to be, especially this portion of it, we really want to be a stakeholder driven piece of it. So thanks for your feedback on how to make sure we get that.
Okay, so just before I close out, following up on that discussion of a smaller scoring criteria red line. So Jason, if you're up for it to kind of taking the lead, it sounds like Renee from Rev Renewables and Bridget Sparks from AES Clean Energy and Doug Karpa from Peninsula Clean Energy are all willing to help you out. So we can connect offline if you need help connecting with those folks. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining. We'll close out with the next steps now. Next slide, please. All right. So here is the Track 2 work group schedule. The next working group meeting is on November 2nd. That is going to be a hybrid meeting. So there is an option to participate in person at the California ISO, as well as with the meeting on November 15th. You'll see in the notice posted today, there's quite a few links for registration. So please read it carefully. About at the top of the notice, the registration links are for those who plan to participate in person. And then if you are planning to participate virtually, at the bottom of the notice, there's a different free registration link. So that will be posted today. And then again, following the work group meetings, those dates are tentative, but again, aiming for the draft final proposal posting mid to late November, all with the end goal of February Board of Governors meeting. Next slide, please. Again, this meeting is being recorded. You will be able to see the recording on the initiative webpage. That link is there in the first bullet point. And if you have any questions today, please email isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. I know we have a few follow-ups and just connections to make. So please send any questions or comments to that email, and I can help you out. Next slide, please. And if you haven't checked out our Energy Matters blogs, please do so. We recently posted a new blog, also written by Danielle Mills, on working with stakeholders toward a significantly reformed interconnection process. So please, subscribe to those monthly blogs and check them out. So again, thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you for our presentation from SCE and AES, and have a great rest of your day.